All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another That Word Chat. So great to see everybody back again. We're back from the ACES conference in Salt Lake City. I forgot where it was this time. Heather and I, and so we've had a little bit of a break, but we're happy to be back and talking today to Lorna Gibb. Lorna Gibb, today is the day that her new book comes out, Rare Tongues, The Secret Story of Hidden Languages. And I was just saying before the show, I didn't get my local bookstore didn't come through for me on a day of publication. They said maybe to be in tomorrow, probably be in tomorrow. So I don't have a copy of the book yet to show you, but Lorna has a copy of the book, the North American book.
I have a copy.
That's what it looks like.
The US one. This is what it looks like. It's really pretty, and I'm really pleased with it.
And we're celebrating because today is the book launch. So it's been out in the rest of the world, the UK anyway, for a while. Earlier this year it came out, I think.
It came out a couple of months ago, and there's a few other countries looking likely, but because I haven't signed yet, I can't say where.
No. So we're not talking translations yet, are we? Are we talking?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Interesting. Well, of course, it's an interesting global look at language. So tell us about the book and tell us what inspired it. I have a question about the sort of the background of it, but tell us what inspired the book.
The book was really a kind of coming together of the two things that I am most interested and love to do. So I originally had a PhD in linguistics. I'm a theoretical phonologist academically. And then about 20 years ago, I started writing books not related to linguistics for a popular market. So I wrote a couple of biographies. I wrote a novel which did quite well. I wrote a big book about childlessness globally. And I thought, I think it's about time that I actually started to bring the two things that I do together and try to make the things that I'm really interested in accessible to a wider audience to see if they might share some of my enjoyment and interest.
So, yeah, and that was my question, is that you're a linguist, but all your books have not been about linguistics, or unless they secretly have been. And you've written it's eclectic, a couple of biographies about famous women, a novel, the one novel, and then some other one or two nonfiction. You've got 6 books altogether. All right, but finally linguistics. So. So I'm going to show my ignorance as much as possible. What is a theoretical phonologist?
It means that when I was practicing as a very kind of strict academic phonologist, I was looking at the sounds of different languages and trying to map them to theoretical structures about how we might be able to understand better how they appear in the human brain. So in the brain, there's something called the lexicon, which is what linguists refer to as the thing that holds language and our ability to make language. And there are lots of different theories around how we can better understand how languages are structured in the lexicon. And I worked within one of those theories in a particular area of language, so it gets more and more specific, and that's what my PhD was on. So I attempted to be a theoretical phonologist. My PhD was on Kikuyu, Finnish and Icelandic, so 3 languages from completely different language groups, using a kind of universal approach that would find commonalities between languages that appeared to have none.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry, you said Finnish and Icelandic, and I didn't catch the first one. The second
Kikuyu.
2 have...
Kikuyu.
And where do we find that?
It's an African language from Kenya.
And how did you choose the languages that you highlighted in your book?
In the book, they were languages that I chose because either I thought they had great stories and would be maybe interesting for a more general, wider readership, or because I had a personal connection with that language and that language had played an important part in my life, in my development. Because the book is also in part a memoir. I thread the languages together. By talking about my passion for language and talking about the way that these languages have been important to me or important to people that I have spoken to them about and listened to.
Mhm. Do you have a favorite?
It's really hard actually. Everybody always asks that. I have, I
Yeah,
have more
sure.
than one. I have more than one. So the language, when I was researching it, I knew a little about whistling languages. I knew about El Silbo, which is the whistling language from Gomera in the Canary Islands, but I had no idea that whistling languages occurred so widely around the world. And I found out that finding out about them and the topography that gave rise to them and the cultural associations with them according to the different countries they happen in was incredibly surprising and fascinating. And I also loved the plain sign language sent from most of what is now the United States of America because I loved the idea that there was this common signed language that was a kind of lingua franca for decades and was used between Native Americans and the colonizers, and it was the default language, and there's lots of historical record of it. So to find those records and to explore the language and then to meet someone who still tries really hard to keep that kind of historical aspect of language going was amazing.
Yeah, right. I didn't properly introduce you. I should say that you're at the University of Stirling in Scotland, where you are associate professor of creative writing and linguistics, and you were Scottish. We can tell by the accent. Born near Glasgow and
Glasgow. Yeah,
Glasgow.
Glasgow.
I always do that wrong.
Everybody does that from the States. It's fine.
Yeah. Yes, but I've been there, and I trained myself to say Glasgow, and I've reverted, I guess. And you did your doctorate at the University of Edinburgh, but you spent much of your life outside of Scotland and internationally, right?
Indeed, most of it. So I'm in Scotland again now because I was offered a very nice job at the University of Stirling in both subjects, which is quite unusual. But I've only been back less than 3 years. Before that, we were in England briefly, and before that, we were in Italy for a number of years, and then before that, we were in Qatar in the Middle East, and
Hmm.
I was in Paris for a couple of years working there. I worked in Finland when I was a postgraduate. So yeah, and my husband is a Dutch New Zealander. So between us, we've been all over the
Ah,
place.
okay. Yes. Is that, and I assume that that informs the interest in language, but of course you didn't have a language, you didn't have the international language background when you went to university, did you?
Not at all. I come from a very working class Scottish family. I grew up in a council estate, went to a state school, but I'm lucky enough to be old enough to have been able to take Latin at my comprehensive school because it's something they used to offer in state schools, but they don't anymore. It's mostly if you're privately educated, you get that chance. And Latin really opened a kind of world to me of languages and what they might mean, but nobody in my family speaks um, anything but our native languages. So they speak English, obviously, but also Scots, which we were kind of raised in my generation to think of as in dialect, but has now been recognised as one of the official languages of Scotland because it's actually quite different syntactically, has very different vocabulary, and that's actually what I grew up using with my mum and dad. So um, I was actually bilingual without calling myself that or
Right,
realizing
without
that
realizing
that's
it.
what
Yeah.
it was. Yeah.
Well, how different is the um, Scottish and or Scottish
Scots.
as opposed to Gaelic, Scots Gaelic?
Gaelic's a completely different thing and not related at all, and I'm not in no way a Gaelic speaker. Gaelic speakers are in the Highlands. It's a rare, threatened language. I interview someone in the book about the state of Gaelic and how difficult the situation is for Gaelic speakers. With Scots, it's only more recently been recognised as a minority language. It's got a history of kind of repression that's very similar in some ways. And indeed, the repression of Scots has meant that some of it has become quite anglicised. But especially for working class people of my generation, and even more so of my mum's generation, it's very different. So if I said to you, in something that would be regarded as a kind of Glasgow or Glasgow adjacent, as some young people call it now, the dialect of the Scots language, I could say to you, "Gies a line of that," and you probably wouldn't know what I meant. And it means, "Please may I borrow that? Can you
Uh,
know, give me a loan of that? Please may I borrow it?" Or I might say, "Hodja which means be quiet a minute, or I might say,
no, that sounds like hold your peace.
it's dreich outside, so we'll carry on together, which means the weather's really terrible outside, it's grey and dark and wet, so we will cuddle in together and stay at home. And we usually only use that with family or loved people or, close friends. And it means we're staying in together tonight, we're staying in.
So what's the history? How does that evolve, and what makes it a separate language?
The reason it's deemed a separate language is to do with quite technical things, to do with the degree of difference between English, but it also has quite a distinct history in the sense that Scotland and England were historically very distinct countries, and the Scots historically in the lowlands spoke Scots and the Highlands spoke Gaelic. And of course, England was a kind of colonizer, an invader, and the language was very dominant as it was over much of the world. And so Scots gradually stopped being used so much, or indeed became stigmatised as something of a working class marker, which is what I grew up with. So I grew up thinking that to use those kind of words and to speak in a very broad dialect, which is my natural dialect with my parents, say, was bad because it meant that I would make grammatical errors in English terms, that is using the grammar of my own language, and could lead to discrimination, could lead to some professions being closed to you, and so on. So now, I've just read this recently at Edinburgh University, there's actually a study and a programme to help students who have the kind of accent that I used to have when I was growing up, and to educate students and their tutors not to discriminate against them on the grounds of the fact that they speak Scots or indeed speak a heavily Scottish version of English.
Um, yeah, interesting. And this is it almost feels like that's something that should not be new.
No, but I think for a long time, I think in some ways, class discrimination is a huge problem in the UK, and in some ways, it's certainly much better than it was when I was young. But in other ways, it hasn't really changed. And I would say that now in some ways, it's even more segregated. And things like the lack of Latin and the opportunities to learn Latin for people who go to comprehensive schools is one example of that.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting, and I've heard that same complaint. I didn't have Latin offered when I was in school. My kids did, but we're in sort of a forward-thinking, wealthier school district that has people who said, "Oh, this is a good thing," and they hired a PhD in Latin to teach it. But I do hear that a lot, that there's very little Latin spoken, and it is such um, a, a gateway to other languages and it shows the appreciation of English as well.
It is.
That's
It's fantastic. It's a fantastic boon for learning other languages. It got me personally the best job I ever had as an undergraduate, where I got well paid for translating Latin from one of my tutors.
oh,
Um, but nowadays, and even more recently, actually, the government's decided to stop subsidising Latin classes for working class kids in comprehensive schools. So it's now once again becoming a marker of being a posh person who can afford private school. So my day that didn't happen, kind of gradually came in, got white, and now again we're kind of going towards this is a marker of someone who's had a private education. It's a real shame.
yeah, right. Did that background lead you to learn other languages or simply?
I think Latin did, yeah. Excuse me, sorry, I have the dregs of some kind of horrible illness that's a bit COVID-esque, but I'm on the last days of it, so I'm much better than it was. So excuse me if I cough, everybody. Um, I think Latin certainly did. Latin opened, I mean, I learned French at school as well, but that wasn't, I loved Latin. I mean, Latin was a kind of passion. And when I went to university, it was originally to study English literature and language, but I ended up doing all these modules on medieval French and medieval Latin and medieval Italian. So I kind of chose that path very early on, basically by my second year at university.
So, I said we would correct something that we had some confused information about, and on the website for what initially when we had it, we said you were a Gallic speaker, and this is not true. You said that that's not even a language you're familiar with, but but you did go to university in London and have a sort of have to deal with that working class Glasgow accent or
Exactly,
sorry
yeah,
language.
and
Yeah,
it was as much. Basically, there was one very bad. I mean, I could switch, so it's a kind of code switching we call it. So I can switch
yeah.
between quite a formal English, a softly accented dialogue, which is what I'm using with you, and I can then switch quite easily to my natural kind of dialect with I'm speaking with my mum, say.
Mm.
However, um, when I was young, I was much less that was a much less easy thing for me to do. So that's been acquired over years, partly through living abroad, I think. But so what I found was that I kind of switched, but couldn't really control when it happened. So I'd be speaking to someone who was from Scotland, and I would sound really broad, and I'd be speaking to, and one of the tutors in my degree course asked me to stand up and demonstrate a working class way of speaking. And I was quite shy then, and this was in front of a large lecture hall. So I got quite angry when I gave my demonstration. This is all in the book. And afterwards felt sad and upset about it. But the kind of experience of that changed the way that I felt about how I spoke.
And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. What we do is we ask people to ask questions if they have any, and then come on camera, and so they can ask you specifically. I have a lot of questions, so I'll just keep going. What I think we're maybe in this group we're all sort of keyed into linguistics and language, and we're aware of endangered languages, but it's maybe a lot of people don't understand. We know that there are animals, especially mammals, we read about that are endangered or going extinct, and what is the state of language in terms of threatened languages and endangered languages right now? Are we in a crisis? Is it
We are in a crisis and it's getting worse. So the rate at which languages are disappearing is increasing. And the kind of history and background of why that's the case is mixed. So in some cases it is to do with colonization and kind of later effects of colonization. In some cases it's to do with control. So particular regimes will often ban or attempt to control the use of a language, because basically if people are speaking about you in a language that you don't understand, you don't really know what they're saying. So a very good way of controlling information is to make sure that everyone is speaking the same language and you as the dictator can understand it. Other things are just to do with modernization. So even kind of well-established languages like Icelandic, for example, worry about the change that's happening in their country to their language because of things like the internet, of which the global language is English, and the kind of focus on English language takes away from maybe the focus of Icelandic even in its own country. So it's quite a mixed bag of reasons. And then of course there's to do with technology. So some of the whistled languages are endangered because of the use of mobile phones, because you don't really need to whistle messages over long distances if you can phone someone easily, and so on. But there are all sorts of reasons, some of them quite nefarious, some of them just more to do with the kind of natural process.
Yeah. I read something recently about Icelandic, and it seems that there's two sort of maybe storylines going on, and one is that that we're more aware of endangered languages, and we're more aware of indigenous rights and the importance of maintaining indigenous culture. And in terms of to relate that to Iceland, it seems like there's been sort of a national pride and a focus on the Icelandic language. But then, I read an article recently that somebody said in a generation or two, we won't be speaking Icelandic because it's not necessary. So I think I don't know if there's a question there, but it seems that there's two different trends, and you can sort of jump onto one and say, oh, things are getting better. But then, as you say, for many reasons, it's not. We have a question in the room related to this.
We do. This question comes from Cindy. If you want to unmute and ask.
Hi, Lorna. Thanks so much for being here today. This is really interesting to me. I'm curious, is there a realistic way that you can save an endangered language? I mean, we've heard so much about the newer generations. They want to conform. They want to be like everybody else. They don't want to speak the way their parents speak. Is there a way to save that, realistically, like we would somehow in the future be able to actually communicate in that language if the native speakers were gone?
It's a really interesting question, actually. And there are people, activists and linguists, who insist that languages don't die at all, that they are in fact dormant, so that a language doesn't really die as long as we have a sound record of it, and therefore can be brought to life again in the future. It's interesting. I think among the activists I spoke to about languages like Khoikhoi, for example, the young people really are taking these languages that were threatened or indeed are not even recognised in parts of South Africa and running with it. So they're really fighting. They're making plays, they're putting on theatrical performances, they're running community centres, they're setting up international groups so they can keep in touch with diaspora who speak the language. And I think in these cases, yes, the languages will resurge. You only have to look at a language like modern Hebrew to see how the idea of a language can grow with the right support, to see that what is actually possible. It's quite incredible. Then you have a language like Hawaiian, which is doing really well now in terms of support for it, in terms of the drive of young people, or Maori in New Zealand, where young people are really excited and keen and proud of the heritage and tradition and interested in learning their language. But again, In other places, it's not true. Partly because in some communities, there's the idea that you need another language to get a good job. That, well, what's the point of learning this language? I'll only use French or English or whatever the colonizing language was, because that's one that has respect. So it's very mixed, and it very much depends on where in the world you're talking about. Excuse me. Let's have some water. But I think there are successful language revitalization programs.
And you mentioned a few. Are there any areas of the world where colonization obviously has inserted English into the world and suppressed it amongst suppressed indigenous languages. I don't know that we see that going on so much. I think hopefully we're in a sort of a post-colonial world in many ways, but are there places where language is being suppressed other than for like economic reasons, but for like reasons of state and power?
I think the Khoikhoi in South Africa is a good example of that. So the Khoikhoi isn't recognized as one of the languages of South Africa, despite many other languages being recognized. Activists feel that part of the reason for this is that Khoikhoi is the language that is used for the names of many places in South Africa, and thus indicates their prior ownership, if you like, of these areas. So by now denying the language and official status, you don't have to think about, well, the name of that piece of land is in Khoikhoi, so maybe actually that's Khoikhoi land. And it's not only, I mean, the English were terrible colonizers, the British were terrible colonizers, but there's also the Portuguese, there's the Spanish, there's the French, there's a whole host of colonizers who went into countries and banned, controlled languages. And it does still go on to some extent. I'm hearing stories, I don't know how accurate, about some of the former countries of Soviet Union who are allying with Russia, and where their own languages are again falling out of favor as we move into these kind of split. Whereas when somewhere like Ukraine, there's a huge support for the language. And
right. And Khoikhoi, is that the clicking language?
It is.
Yeah. Okay. There's Trevor Noah famously speaks and uses in his autobiography uses the clicking language, I guess, mainly for place names when he's being accurate with them.
Miriam Makeba used to sing in clips, which was amazing. But Khoikhoi is famous for it. But there are many other African languages with really interesting, phonetically important click sounds.
So I'm trying to figure out why. I'm wondering why languages do form, and for such limited. It's understandable, I suppose. Icelandic is fairly isolated, and so their language is going to develop differently from other languages. But then you have languages in Africa and in Southeast Asia, where you'll have an island with 100 different languages. And I don't know if I'm exaggerating that.
Papua New Guinea is the famous example of that, because there are just so many languages there.
Why is that?
I actually can't remember the number, because I've not worked on Papua New Guinean languages, but it's a huge, huge number for quite a small area.
And why is that, though?
Sorry?
Why is that?
It's just to do with lack of communication between the different language groups. So there was no homogenization across them. They kept distinct cultures, distinct groups, and there was no linguistic homogenization because there was no real need or wish, or in some cases, historically, the possibility to intermingle.
The villagers are self-sufficient. There's probably little trading going on, and no need to communicate. It's interesting. Um, what are countries? I may have asked this already, but it feels like there's been sort of a growth in awareness. So are countries doing a better job now of recognizing and supporting endangered languages?
I think some countries are. Not all countries are. I could get political here, but I will try
Oh,
to.
please do.
No. I think there has to be a desire for a society and a culture to be multilingual, and for that to be something that the society or the country is proud of. And certainly, even in my own country, I'm not going to talk about the States, that's often not the case. So there's a kind of there's a certain political type of person who won't want unusual foreign languages because they're not part of British culture, but they don't see that British culture can evolve, develop, and become better by embracing these different tongues.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I don't want to be too personal. My mother, is sort of, well, she's 100 years old, and so she doesn't quite grasp the idea that England can be a multilingual country, and that the Indian and Pakistani and other influences are a good thing. And I do point out that it was an empire, it is a commonwealth, and all these countries are, the people of the world are there partly because England colonized them, and many of these countries share the king, or have until recently. So yeah. I shouldn't.
Well, there's always things like the attitude towards Spanish in the US,
Yeah.
which is interesting. I mean, I'm always slightly bewildered why everyone doesn't learn Spanish in the US and why everyone isn't bilingual. I mean, it
Yes.
seems like such a major language.
Yeah, that's true. But I suppose the same thing in Canada, where you have an entire province that speaks French. But and there is a move toward bilingualism, but in terms of government signs and government messages and things, but in reality, English speakers speak English, and many of them are very limited French. There's no real motivation to learn that second language.
I haven't spent much time in kind of Quebec, Montreal, and so on. I went a few times when I was a graduate student, and I know next to nothing about this, but I was really surprised by the tension between the two cultures. And this is years ago, because I haven't been to Canada recently. But at that time, there was a lot of tension, and I felt I was a guest of French speakers. And I felt that they were very much treated as second-class citizens by some people.
Yeah, right.
I don't know about that. It's a simple observation. It's not something I've explored or studied or.
Right. Well, of course, there was an active separatist movement in Quebec, and I suppose that. So it is this us versus them sort of thing, the special status sort of thing. But it is amazing how, with anything, with the color of our skin, we identify with people, and maybe we fear differences, but in terms of language, what's not to like about French speakers? I don't know. It's a beautiful language, and the linguistic diversity, as you say, it adds to our culture in so many ways. But of course, there are so many counterexamples where people simply don't want to embrace cultural diversity. So we're stuck with that. is there anything at the, forgive me if I'm being too specific, but I'm asked if certain countries are doing a good job, or are there organizations, NGOs?
Yeah, I mean, the United Nations is doing a great job. There's the UNESCO kind of year of endangered languages and so on. So there's a lot of high profile organizations involved in highlighting the issues. But I think the most interesting work is going on at a much more local level. So for example, Womisaurus, which is an endangered language within Poland, spoken in a village. There's this amazing man there who does work to kind of bring the language to wider attention, and he has international language learning groups where people are learning to speak his language, and they meet very regularly, and then they all come to the village and get together and speak Womisaurus. So I think a lot of the most interesting work has been done by very determined and enthusiastic individuals.
And what can we do to support?
Most people would say learn a language, but I'm quite a bad example of that because I am learning a language, but I'm learning Spanish. So I'm not learning one of these protected languages, partly because I regret that. I speak Italian, and I bitterly regret that I can't speak Spanish. And people say, oh, it will be easier for you. You can speak, and it's not, because I get interference between the two languages. My Spanish is appalling. And I really want to speak Spanish, and I love Spanish literature, so I'm learning Spanish. But one thing you can do is to try to learn an endangered language. Even apps like Duolingo now offer classes in many unusual and rare languages. Or you can just read a bit more about these languages, try and see what they have to offer. Look at organizations that are trying to give exposure to ways to protect them, ways to help them, contact them, see what you can do.
Okay. We have another question from our audience.
We do. This one's from Patty. Do you want to unmute and ask Patty?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. This is fascinating. I was wondering if there must be oral depositories for protected or endangered languages. Is there like a body for that and how that works? And also, I just was wondering if you could compare like non-written languages from written languages and how they compare in terms of does non-written make them more endangered? So,
of course, it's a good question, Patty. Of course, a non-written language, a language that is far more likely to go into decline. And indeed, we may already have lost many oral only languages without knowing, because they haven't left a legacy as to how they were structured. In terms of repositories, there are many. And it very much depends on the language. So there are a few that were created by Christian missionaries. I spoke to, this is in the book, but I spoke to an Aboriginal woman from Australia, and she was saying that the irony is that the only record of some of the languages around her are those created by colonizers, who were the very people who made them endangered in the first place. So you get this very circular, contradictory reality. So there are indeed, it's not a single repository for all languages. This is something that it would depend on the language you were interested in, and then you'd have to look for where the archive was. But yes, there are, and these are getting much, much better. And there are many, many excellent linguists who devote their lives to cataloguing and trying to understand and record these linguistic nuances, as well as the grammatical, phonetic, semantic features of the language itself.
It feels like, in this day and age, that somebody ought to develop a Wikipedia of endangered languages, where we could just go and have one source and have audio examples and
There is an online resource where you can look up languages and find examples. It's a kind of Wikipedia thing, but it's not exhaustive. It's not always accurate. And I suspect I haven't used it, but I suspect there'd be quite a few languages missing. I'm not sure what's happening in terms of AI with regard to this. There may well be some move to create some kind of AI facility that does this, but I don't know.
That's interesting. I mean, that's again irony that, I mean, in many ways, AI, at least initially, is perpetuating English as a lingua franca and doesn't really do well yet with other languages. But that would be interesting to see if there's a way to employ AI to help us preserve and create dictionaries of. So does writing a dictionary? I assume writing a dictionary, writing things down, is a great way to preserve a language.
Well, it is, and that's how I first learned about Khoikhoi, because I had a job working on a computer dictionary of Khoikhoi, or Nama, as we called it then. So that's how I got to know that language, by having a job that involved cataloging it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And is that effort strong going on? People cataloging languages?
With Khoikhoi in Namibia, it's great because it's now taught in schools. There are lots of moves by the government to make it the first language in some primary schools, to introduce it into education, to kind of give it more prestige as a language. So that's really good. Khoikhoi in South Africa is a slightly different issue. So it depends on the country as well as the language.
So is it more widely spoken in Namibia?
It's widely spoken in Namibia. It's not the only language of Namibia by any means, but it is widely spoken. But it's not so much that it's that South Africa has tended to favor the Bantu languages rather than all of the African languages. That I think activists tell me, and they're the people I listen to, that this is largely about land reclamation, and I tend to see that as being a very well-argued position.
I have a question that maybe doesn't relate, but I'll ask you because it's a curious thing. When I did go to Scotland and Ireland specifically, I went to Galway, and it was very interesting because you did hear a lot more of the original language in Galway. But a curious thing, we went into a shop in Galway, and the person speaking was speaking with an American accent, or he seemed like an American speaking with an English or an Irish accent to us, and we thought, well, he's but we asked her, we talked to her friend after, and he said, no, that it's a trend now that teenagers or young people are adopting an American accent. They watch Friends and they watch American television, and they have that accent. Have you noticed this?
Not in Scotland. It's not common at all. I have a bad habit of picking up accents. So if I sit here and talk to you for long enough, I will start sounding vaguely American. I mean, it's just how. But it's not usual. I mean, people are prouder of their accents, I would say, than when I was young. You may get people with more anglicized accents. Again, for some people, that's a marker of private education or a wealthier upbringing. But I haven't seen a kind of trend towards Americanization. And certain words, yes, but Z's for S's and haven't caught on yet as well.
Right. And I wasn't aware. I didn't sort of listen to him long enough to know how much it was simply an accent, but it certainly was pronounced. I should say it was Stan Carey, who many people know, linguist in Galway, who was not surprised at all by that, and said that's kind of a trend, which I suppose is a thing that an endangered language has to deal with. Young people are watching television and learning English in school and maybe preferring that to their own.
Yeah,
But
I mean, it's not happening in Scotland. It may well be happening in Ireland. I mean, they're very different countries. I don't know.
yeah,
It wouldn't particularly surprise me, especially given the kind of plethora of US media and the popularity of US shows.
Mhm.
But I mean, I teach lots of Scottish students, and none of them have American accents. But I also
Do
have
you-
quite a few American students.
I'm sorry.
I also have quite a few American students
Oh,
who come over.
yes,
So,
yeah. Um, I had a question. I lost my train of thought. I'll come back to it. Let me ask you about before we run out of time. I wanted to ask you about your other books. You've got two biographies of interesting, well-traveled women. Is that does that say something about your personality that you have this interest in strong and maybe not non-conforming women?
I think it probably does actually. I mean, I wrote about Lady Hester Stanhope, who is an extremely unconventional 18th century traveller that I absolutely loved, and I loved her period and the way she very openly defied convention, and the fact that she was quite scornful of Lord Byron while everyone else was kind of falling over him. But she's a great character, so I loved writing that book, and that was really my first popular book. That was for Faber and Faber, so it's kind of mass market book. And I loved writing it. I got to spend lots of time in the Lebanon. I went horse riding in the Shoof, and so it was an amazing experience to write. The next book was about a woman I wrote, was about Dame Rebecca West, and it was published in the US as well by Counterpoint in San Francisco. And she fascinated me for an entirely different reason, mainly because she was so diverse in her output, which was quite rare, especially for women at that time. So she wrote everything from biographies to best-selling novels to journalism, really important journalism, especially in the States around lynchings and so on. She reported on the Nuremberg trials. But she was this incredibly diverse writer with an incredibly turbulent and difficult personal life. So that's why I wrote about her. The greatest gift that book gave me was I got to spend time in Oklahoma, which I loved. So most of her archives are oddly at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma.
Yes.
So I went and stayed in TU for almost 2 months, and I love horses. And I was there in Labour weekend, and the whole place shut for 3 days. And I thought, what am I going to do? And I went on Facebook, and I had a big horse group that had lots of people in the States. And this woman nearby who had this amazing, beautiful horse ranch says to me, what are you doing? Are you just sitting there on your own? I said, yeah, it's fine. I mean, the archive's shut. But she said, I'm coming to get you. So she drove to get me, drove me to her ranch, and I spent a long weekend with all sorts of interesting horse activities and riding, and then I just kept going there at the weekends when the archive shut. So it was absolutely magical 2 months.
Wow.
It was amazing, and it was really the first time that I'd seen a very different part of the US, because I was much more used to New York. I did a conference in Vegas for many, many, many years, and I mean, I actually love Vegas. I didn't the first time I went, but I ended up loving it because I made friends there. And again, it was very much not about Strip, but about the city of Vegas and the kind of people there.
Yeah.
And my husband would come sometimes, and we'd add on a holiday week, and we'd get a Mustang convertible, and we'd drive out to Death Valley or to Utah or to Los Angeles, and so I loved it, and those were all kind of tied to that book and to the next book. So that was, and the novel the novel meant a lot of European travel, which was fantastic because it did well in Europe. It wasn't published in the US though. It was quite a strange literary novel, so I don't know if it didn't appeal in the US. It was called A Ghost Story,
Yeah.
and it follows this ghost through history, but it's kind of written like the biography of a ghost.
Hmm.
But she is a historically recognised character, so she's slightly odd. And then I'm childless. My husband and I are childless, not by choice. And I wrote a book about global childlessness and women's experience of childlessness all over the world.
What did you learn from that book?
That while being childless, not by choice, is a difficult thing, my life is a lot easier than a lot of people in other cultures where their very being is defined by their ability to have a child or not.
So was there, I think I've asked you this, but let me ask you again. What was the motivation then? You wrote all these other books. Did you think, okay, I'm a linguist, eventually I'm going to write a linguistics book, or what?
No, I didn't really. I care about multiculturalism in a sense that I am genuinely really fascinated to listen to and learn about other people's languages, the cultures that those languages express. And I do fear for kind of growing homogenization. I kind of think this whipping up fear of migrants, whipping up fear of the other, which is quite prevalent in right-wing politics in many parts of the world these days, is just not a good thing, frankly. And I thought I can't really talk about that politically. I'm not a political person, or I'm not educated in politics, but I am educated in linguistics. And it's also nice to share something that you spent a lot of years studying with a wider audience when you have something that you think might actually interest lots of people rather than just the 10 academics working on your field.
Yeah, right. So it is interesting that in some ways the language, if we accept it, it brings us together, and yet the fact that we have languages is sort of people staking their claim to their own physical space or their own political idea. So there's kind of a competing thing going on there, and I don't know. Maybe that's part of. Maybe there's a history of suppression there that's based on, this idea that we don't want to be, we don't want you having your own thing. But I'm starting to ramble because I'm not sure where I'm going with that. But I'm interested in the irony of it. I suppose that there are two different competing forces, and that we're having this sense of bringing people together by supporting their individual identities.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you working on next?
I'm slightly superstitious about talking what I'm working on.
Yeah, I understand.
But I have finished part of another novel, but I am glacially slow at writing novels, so I think there is very likely to be another non-fiction book before I actually finish the novel properly. This is not because I'm slow at writing them, but because I constantly rewrite them in a very finicky way. Whereas with the non-fiction books, I write them, then do a whole big rewrite, then fact check, and it will take 2 or 3 years. The novels take forever. I mean, they percolate slowly and then appear as strange literary masses. But
Interesting process.
Ideas that I'm working on, and my US editor actually has agreed to have a chat about them, so we'll see what happens next.
Yeah, okay. Does the novel feature a strong female lead character?
No.
No, okay. I won't ask you anymore. You don't want to. obviously you don't want to spend too much time talking about something that's not yet formed, but we'll look forward to it. And that's great. Anything in nonfiction, anything specifically in linguistics you'd like to tackle?
Sorry?
Anything in linguistics, in the linguistic field specifically, that you'd like to tackle as a next?
At some point, I think I'm interested in trying to write a very a kind of book about the way different people think language might be structured in the brain. So I'm quite interested in writing something like that for a popular audience. There are many, many books about it, but I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in the way that language is used to manipulate us in different forms, in different ways. So I'm quite interested in that. But and that ties into one of the books I might do next, but I haven't decided because I have two things that I'm quite keen on.
Okay, that's interesting. I think David Crystal's probably tackled that last one, but then he's written everything, right? I think he's got a new book out now as well.
There are other people who've written about it too, but not in the same way.
Yeah.
So there's an excellent book called Stand Out of My Light, which is about advertising and the effect it has on us. I can't remember who's by. I read it quite a few years ago. So there's a lot of work on that, but I'm doing something from a completely different perspective. So it's not actually about
okay.
that. It's just, but that's something that interests me as a general topic. I wouldn't write a book just about that. They tend to be a bit too dry, I find. You need something that catches people's interest. So you need a kind of something more general, really. Something that people say, "Oh, that's exciting. What does that mean?" I think. I'm not sure.
Well, it depends. Yeah. Well, whatever it is, we'll read it. I've been reading the Rebecca West book and enjoying that, and I've been looking through I don't have the physical copy, but I was sent a PDF of the endangered language book, and so I appreciate your writing, and I appreciate you coming to talk to us. It's getting late in Scotland, but
it is late. I'll be going to bed soon.
yeah. Fair enough. We appreciate you coming on, and thanks all for joining us. We'll be back. I think we'll be back next month. We don't plan all that well, but we definitely have some guests we're looking at bringing on, and we're excited to bring to you and talk to. And we should have somebody next month. So.
Whereabouts are you, Mark? Where are
Pardon
you
me?
in the States? Whereabouts are you?
I'm in Columbus, Ohio, which is Eastern time.
Ohio. Ah.
Well, you should come to Ohio and do a book signing. I'll go to the local bookstore and yeah. So I'm Eastern time zone, but and actually, half the population is in the Eastern time zone. I'm on the Western side of it.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Across the time zone. And are your regular listeners mostly from the same state, or are they from all over?
All over, and I think we have some from the UK, and occasionally we get an Australian, but the timing's sort of difficult for that part of the world. When we have guests from Australia, they're usually sort of drinking their coffee and blinking a lot. But no, I think we have guests from all over the country and from Canada, and we always have somebody from the UK and sometimes elsewhere. So yeah, it's always a nice group and a nice topic and a nice discussion.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Well,
and
thank you,
everyone for joining us.
We'll see you next time.
Okay. See you
Take
next
care,
time.
everybody. Catherine Schmidt tuning in from Southwest Germany. There we go.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you.